Hello again. It's the last time, you'll be pleased to know. Now, see, if I'm honest, and I looked at that passage and I read that passage, it basically boils down to being the standard polite introduction to a letter of the day. It's kind of the ancient equivalent of, "Dear sir, thank you for your email. I hope my response finds you well." And how do you preach on that? Oh, yes, God is clearly speaking to us through this standard response. And the answer, obviously, inevitably, is because it is the Bible. It isn't just a stock response. Even if it were, it's in the Bible, and therefore there is a reason for it. So I'm a firm believer that any and every part of the Bible can be preached on, can be spoken on, can teach us something. And if we are prepared to ask the right questions and listen to God in the right way, then everything in the Bible speaks. And so even though it is this kind of fairly innocuous introduction to a letter, I think God speaks to it. And so if we, for example, if we turn to verse 2, so we go to verse 2, and in verse 2, we see the address. Paul addresses the letter to the church of God in Corinth. Except he also doesn't do that. The word that Paul uses is a Greek word that I will pronounce wrong, but James isn't here and Abby's out there. So at least two of the people that know that properly aren't listening. But it's something roughly like Ekklesia. And Ecclesia, which is actually where we get all those knock-on words like ecclesiastic and all that kind of stuff. Ecclesia is often translated from the Bible as church. We go, okay, so when we see Ecclesia, it means church, as in the church of God in Corinth. But actually, strictly, that's not what the word ecclesia means. The word ecclesia means assembly. In the sense of a gathering, not in the sense of rows of tiny children sat on a hardwood floor. Assembly, people gathered together, people who have assembled. And it doesn't necessarily imply religion. It just means a gathering of people. So if we were to turn to Acts 19, and you're welcome to do this later if you like, in Acts 19, we get the account of a riot in Ephesus. And 3 times in that story, in verse 32, 39, and 41, at least in the NIV, you get the word assembly. And if you dive back into the Greek, if you get into linear, you can see that the word is ecclesia. And it's not saying the rioters were a church, or the courts were a church, or the people that went home were a church. It's just saying they were an assembly, a gathering of people. And you might be thinking, why does this matter? Why does it matter, Dave? It's just a word. Who cares? It matters because words matters, and the way that we look at ourselves and the way God and the Bible teach us to look at ourselves matters. See, the word ecclesia here helps us to understand how the Corinthians thought about themselves. Because there are, in Greek, apparently, other words that if you really wanted to say religious assembly, you could use those words. That Greek has words for that, but they choose not to use them. They deliberately choose to be seen as an ecclesia. When Paul writes to them, he calls them an ecclesia. He's naming them in that way. I want you to be seen as an assembly. We choose to be seen as an assembly, an ordinary gathering. We are not different to the other groups in our community. And yet, and this is I love this kind of tension and balance that we get in the Bible so often. At the same time, they are different. Because they're not just an ecclesia. In Greek, they're ecclesia to theou, which means assembly of God, a gathering of God. They are regular people made distinct by the purpose of their gathering. That's what makes them different. Not who they are, but why they are. And some of you are going, well, yeah, but that's a church then, isn't it? That's a church. Ecclesia can be a church. That's fine. Yes, but, I mean, take us, for example. So we are, as you're probably aware, we are CCC. We are the Crediton Congregational Church. Now, I noticed when I was writing this, that's an interesting name because congregation means a gathering of people. And church, or Ecclesia, means a gathering of people, which means we've brilliantly called ourselves the Crediton Gathering of Gathering, or the Crediton Assembly, which is lovely. I'm not, this is not a let's change our name thing, but that amused me. But that's not the point. The point is more this. Imagine a group of people. Imagine that group of people in a pub or watching the rugby out on a muddy field somewhere, or gathering together to do a parent and toddler group or something. What would you call them? What would you call that group of people? Probably, I don't know, crowd, maybe down at the rugby. That would be a crowd, maybe a gathering, maybe a club. You probably wouldn't call them a congregation. You wouldn't say, I'm just off to the pub for a congregation. No. Because congregation has a very specific meaning, doesn't it? When we say congregation, we don't just mean group of people. We mean a group of people that gather probably in a church on a Sunday morning. It's such a specific term that even people that gather in a church not on a Sunday morning, we don't call them a congregation. Fish Tank is not a congregation. Coffee and Company is not a congregation. This, and only this, is a congregation. In effect, we're saying this is a group of people that are different to you. When you're at the pub, you're not a congregation. When you're this, you're not. Only here, only if you come here to this place at this time are you congregation. Otherwise, you're not. You're out. We are different to you because we are a congregation. And Paul says, yeah, you're an ecclesia, aren't you? You're an assembly. You're not different. You are the same as those people. You're the same as those people that go to the rugby and go to the pub and go to the parent and toddlers. Because the difference is not you, the difference is God. And then in verse 4, Paul gives thanks for the Corinthians. And if you're following in Greek, he uses the word Eucharist at that point as well, which is quite nice. And it's an interesting choice. And some commentators have looked at this and gone, he's being a bit sassy there, isn't he? Because Corinthians is a letter that in large part is written to a church to go, some of those things you're doing, stop doing them. You know, those disagreements you're having, stop having disagreements. You shouldn't be disagreeing about that. Some of your, the way that you're living from a moral point of view or what you're condoning, stop doing that because it's not very good. There's a bit of telling off coming in this letter. And so some people go, well, opening with, oh, I'm really thankful for you. Here's what you're doing wrong. Paul's being mildly sarcastic there, or at best ironic. Now, personally, I think that's a bit unfair. I think Paul, when he wants to be, can be sarcastic. This is not that. If he'd said, I thank God for your I can't say the word, unanimity, is that it? Greek, fine. English words, not so much. So that word, the unitedness of them all, if he'd written, I'm thankful for that, that probably would have been irony, given what's coming. If he'd picked out certain characteristics only to then say, but you don't really do it, that would not have been kind. But actually, that's not what he does. He thanks God for the grace that God has given to the Corinthians. You can always thank for that. That's always a thing you can be thankful for because God gives grace freely. Say, I thank God for the grace given you. Absolutely. No matter what's going on. It's not what they've done or what they haven't done. It's for the grace that has been given to them. And he goes on to say that they have been enriched by this grace. Because you have received grace from God, you are better for it. He pulls out the speech, says, think about the way that you speak. Think about the way that you have understanding of God. These things have come from the grace of God, and this has transformed you, and that transformation bears witness to the truth of the gospel. You live in the grace of God. You are transformed by the grace of God. and therefore you show that grace to be real. And by showing that grace to be real, you preach the gospel with your lives. And that is a thing that I thank God for. And I think that's a beautiful way to open. Because even though he's going to say, there are some things you need to do, he's saying, but first and foremost, you are full of God's grace and you preach the gospel simply by being so. Well done. But it brings us back to thinking about Ecclesia. See, this grace transformation of the Corinthian church, it matters because they are part of their community. They can preach the gospel by being transformed because they are in the community. You know, they're not, we have that phrase that's it's a paraphrasing of something Jesus said, to be in the world and not of the world. Well, the Corinthian church is in the community, not of the community, if you like. And it's a really tricky balance because, and thinking about us as much as the Corinthian church at this point, we can be so much a part of the community that we live in that people are no longer able to point to any kind of difference. We can embed ourselves so firmly in our community that people might go, actually, I didn't even know you were a Christian. On the other hand, we can be so concerned with standing apart and making that distinction clear that actually we find ourselves no longer around to make any kind of difference. I'm not having a dig at monks, but that idea of let's all go and shut ourselves away in a monastery, amazing. You can be incredibly holy, but what difference is that making to a lot of people who are never going to see you? In fact, switching from monks to nuns, anyone familiar with the 90s film Sister Act? Yeah, good. It's a classic. Excellent. Just for the two or three of you that missed it, it's got Whoopi Goldberg in it in the 90s, and she's a lounge singer. She witnesses a murder, and she has to go into a witness protection scheme. And for reasons of plot contrivance, it can only be in a monastery in San Francisco, in a nunnery convent in San Francisco. I'm still unclear as to exactly why, but because it's funny, I think. And there are shenanigans, and there's singing, and there's culture clash, and there's Whoopi Goldberg basically being 90s Whoopi Goldberg. And it's great. And this convent is interesting because it's in a rundown area of San Francisco, and they will cut away to what I think is probably actual genuine footage of San Francisco people just looking fairly run down and poverty-stricken and tough life. And the convent itself has got these big kind of chain link fences around it, and it's covered in graffiti on the outside, and it's got big iron gates across the front. Imagine if we gated off the top of the stairs, for example. It's like a little fortress. And then there's this brilliant bit in the middle of the movie. I think it's my favorite bit of the movie, in which they basically have a montage because it's a 90s film. And in this musical montage, Whoopi Goldberg convinces the nuns that locking themselves away in this convent is not what they're there for. And so they take down the fences, and they remove the gates, and they repaint their walls with murals, and they go out and they start to engage with people. And we get a couple of the nuns doing street dancing. One of them is very bad, but it's still funny. Some of them doing, I believe it's called double Dutch skipping. I could never do it. It's the one where you've got two ropes going at the same time. It looks like a nightmare. But they do that, and they chat to people, and they just engage with their community. But whilst still being nuns, they're all still wearing their habits. They've got they've got a full penguin nun outfit. I don't know how to. I know it's got a real name, but I can't remember what it is. But that nun thing that makes them look like penguins. That one. They don't hide it. They don't go, oh, we're off into the community, we better put on our regular clothes. They go, no, we're in the community. We are nuns. And as a consequence of all this, people begin to come into the church. And so the church attendance goes up and people engage. And it's a two-way thing, because they've not stopped being nuns. They've not said we're no longer doing our holy thing. We're going to ignore God now to engage with the community. They're saying we want to do both. We want to engage with God, and we want to be part of our community. We want to talk to them and have fun with them and help them. That is Ecclesia to Theou, a community of God, an assembly for God, because it's living the gospel in the heart of the community. It's distinct. I mean, they are distinctive. You can see them coming, but they're not separate. And that is the balancing point. How can we live in such a way that we're part of our community and we retain the distinctiveness that comes from following Jesus? How can we do both of those things? And as is so often the case, Jesus is quite a good example of this. Because we read about Jesus doing awesome things. He goes to weddings. Well, he goes to a wedding that we know about. I imagine he went to others. So he goes to weddings. He eats meals with all sorts of people. Sometimes with his friends. He's got a whole kind of bunch of guys in Bethany that he just hangs out with. But he's got other people that he goes and has more formal meals or eats with them for a reason. Or Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house. He goes to all sorts of people to eat with them. He has, as far as we can see, a social life. We sometimes focus on Jesus the teacher and Jesus the Messiah, but, he has actual friends. He has people that he enjoys the company of. He engages with the community around him. And he does it without compromising who he is. I don't know about you, but I really struggle to imagine the idea of Jesus going off down the taverna with the guys and, dropping in some swear words because it will help him fit in. Yes, Jesus going out socially, Jesus swearing to fit in. No, Jesus getting very drunk to fit in. No, Jesus doing things that are going to compromise who he is just because it will make him more friends. No. Be in the community, but not of the community. So where do we fit? Where do we fit on that scale of in, not of? And I'm not, it is a rhetorical question, but it's also not. It's an actual question that I want us to think about. And by us, I mean you. And also me, but specifically you. Not us collectively, but personally, individually. Am I so deeply embedded in my community that they don't actually know that I'm a Christian? I don't tell them that it's just what I do on a Sunday. I go to church on a Sunday. I don't really make a big deal about it. I don't talk about it on Monday. It's just a thing that I do. It's between me and God. No one else needs to know. Because if I told them, they probably wouldn't hang out with me anymore. Or they'd think differently of me. On the other hand, am I so committed to the pursuit of God that I have time for nothing else? I would tell anyone and everyone that I meet about God, but I don't meet anyone because I'm always busy doing things at the church or going to clubs or doing societies. And actually, I don't have anyone left to tell. I couldn't find it, but I believe there's a graph that essentially indicates how many Christian people you know. And it goes like this. You become a Christian. You know lots of non-Christian people. By the time you've been in church about 2 years, you don't know very many non-Christians. And the longer you are in a church, the less and less Christians you know, because these people, and it's lovely that these people become your friends, not those people. Your friendship group changes. You know less people. And you get so involved in following God that you can't tell anybody about it because who do you know left to tell? Where do we sit on that balance of in the community, but not of the community? When I was 16, I had a friend. Bless, I remember that. I've still got friends now. But when I was 16, I had a particular friend, and this friend was called Tim. And the thing about Tim was that he was a Christian, and I was not. And at 5 o'clock on a Sunday, everything stopped. Because at 5 o'clock on a Sunday, Tim had to go to church. I say had to go to church. Tim chose to go to church. He wanted to go to church. So whatever we were doing, and we had a group of friends, and we would get together with this group of friends most weekends, and we would go rock climbing, or we'd do Warhammer, or we'd go down the downs and just mess about. Whatever we were doing at 5 o'clock, sorry, boys, got to finish up, off to church, evening service. And it was, I've got to be honest, initially a bit frustrating. Dude, we're in the middle of doing a thing. Well, yeah, it's 5 o'clock though, I've got to go. But eventually we begin to plan around it. You don't plan to be in the middle of a game at 5 o'clock, you know you've got to be finished by 5. You know you can't be hanging off a sandstone wall somewhere in the middle of the county late into the afternoon because we've got to get Tim back because he goes to evening church. And that commitment was one of the things that led me to going to the youth group that he went to that was built around the evening service at the church that he went. Because I thought, good grief, if this is important enough that whatever we're doing, he will stop doing it and go and do this, that might be quite interesting then. It was. But it was that, more than anything else, more than, oh yeah, Tim's the one that doesn't swear. More than anything like that, it was Tim going, I really want to be part of this group. I am part of this group. I am one of your friends, but also God. See, if he hadn't been prepared to stand out like that, I probably wouldn't be here now. Because I wouldn't have gone to that church and I wouldn't have become a Christian. I wouldn't have done everything else. But equally, if he hadn't got involved with us, if he'd just gone, I'm a church person, not hanging out with those heathens, then I would never have seen that practical outworking of his faith. See, and I realize that this is a long time ago and I'm probably idealizing it a bit, but I think that's a really good example of finding that balance. He was in our community, but he was still of God, not of us. So let me ask you again, have you found that balance? Because if you haven't yet, or if you think you're kind of there, but you think you could do it better, which I've got to be honest, is probably most of us, what are you going to do to change it? What do you need to do to balance it better? I mean, ultimately, none of us are perfect. And as we read through Corinthians, or we look at bits of Corinthians at least, we're going to see that. The whole point of Corinthians is Paul saying to the church, this is not perfect. This needs to be done differently. But let's also remember that Paul opens his letter with those words of thanks. I always thank my God for you because of his grace given you in Christ Jesus. We've already been given grace. We are already loved. We are already part of God's community, and we are already part of God's family. What God is calling us to do now is to search for ways to live that will help others to find that grace too. So as we go out from here this morning, ask yourself, how do I find that balance? And then perhaps ask God and say, Lord, show me. How do I chase you? How do I love you and pursue you and follow you in all things, and yet still live in such a way that others can see me doing it, not for my glory, but for yours? How can my passion for you, God, draw others into a passion for you too? Because if we can find that, then we're finding Ecclesia. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that you present us with these challenges of balancing our lives for you. And we ask that you guide us, because we can't do this on our own thinking and our own working out. But we ask that you would show us, how do we pursue you and love the people around us, and do it in such a way that we can be an example of you that makes a difference. Lord, help us love you enough that we find the ways to love the people around us too. Thank you for the grace that you've given, that we know that we do this with you, not alone, but as part of your community and family. Amen.